Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Barnyards and Backyards Live. I'm Jeff Edwards for UW Extension, and we're switching things up a little bit today. My co-host today is Abby Perry. Good morning, Abby.
Good morning.
She is also an extension educator for the University of Wyoming and is in Carbon County in Rawlins. And Jenny Thompson, who is with us, who you may hear but may not see today, kind of keeps everything going for us and making sure everything is operating correctly in the background. So thank you, Jenny, for being here. And our guest today is Jeremiah Vardaman, just to kind of mess everybody up, right?
And
So,
me.
yeah, and Jeremiah. Jeremiah will be talking to us about grapes and how to grow them and get things started in our interesting environment of Wyoming. But before we get to the program, I would like to remind everybody that if you are joining us via Zoom and new to Zoom, if you take your mouse and scroll over the top of the page, there will be a series of buttons at the bottom. If you have questions for any of us, particularly for Jeremiah today, please use the Q&A button or the chat button and type your question in there. And we will pull that forward as time permits or as the appropriateness of the question to the discussion. And if you are participating via Facebook today, if you have a question for us, please type that in the chat. And Jenny is monitoring the chat box in Facebook, and she'll send it our direction. And we'll get those questions asked. So I think, Jeremiah, it's your turn, man. Let's talk about grapes.
All right, let me share my screen. Hopefully we can do this and we all remember our roles, mainly me, and I don't start asking myself questions, right?
Yeah.
So, oh, that doesn't help if we're at the end of the show. Let me restart that.
And we thought you were prepared.
I thought I was too. Yeah. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to switch the seats and get into the hot seat here and do a presentation on grapes. So this has been a long effort. The first time I've been a part of growing grapes in Wyoming was back in 2013. I helped install the first vineyard at the research center over in Sheridan. And then it's just been kind of growing and morphing from there. And so it's kind of a unique thing. There's a lot of people that do know that grapes grow here, right? But a lot of times it's a surprise. People are like, oh, really? We can grow grapes, right? But it's kind of a tricky conversation and tricky thing to navigate, just like all Wyoming topics. There are certain specific things we need to know to be successful. So
we can grow them, but we have different challenges than other states.
Right, exactly. And just a fun fact about grapes, right? So grapes are grown in every state in the nation, in the United States here. So kind of unique in that regards. And so again, it's a surprise. It's not something you think of coming to Wyoming and being like, hey, we can grow grapes in Wyoming. So, but to try and capture the efforts that have been done at the research centers, so the one in Sheridan and then the research center at Powell, we put together this Wyoming grape guide for everybody's benefit to hopefully help them be successful and try and be a comprehensive get started with vineyard type management. So it is a big topic and we're not going to be able to cover it all today. It's going to be this is kind of in a nutshell what you need to know as a beginner to get started with grapes. And then we were just joking before the show, if I do well enough, maybe we can bring me back and do some follow-up specific topics. So,
but we'll ask you for that our audience participants will ask you for that feedback later on if you really want me to come back.
Or maybe not the feedback, right?
Right.
We'll find out how this goes. So just this image. So this is at the Powell Research Center. This was one of the photos that we took of harvesting. That was our first year of harvesting grapes, and we were pretty ecstatic. That is Frontenac Grape is the cluster there that I'm holding. So a pretty good production, right? A pretty good size cluster, not always the largest berry size necessarily, but that's going to be variety specific too.
And we're not thinking of those as table grapes, right? We're thinking of those for wine purposes.
Right. Yeah. So this variety in specific is more of a wine grape. However, and we'll get to that when we talk varieties. But
okay.
So they categorize those into wine grapes, juice or jelly grapes, or into table grapes. And so the majority of the varieties that are grown at the centers are wine grapes. However, you can eat these, right, as fresh grapes, as table grapes. The biggest thing with probably one of the largest difference between wine grapes and table grapes is seeds, right? Wine grapes, a high percentage of those have seeds in them. Table grapes, they can come in seeded or seedless forms. So that's kind of one of the big difference. In terms of grapes, when you're thinking of putting in a vineyard for whatever your perspective is or purpose, and thinking, oh, I want to have some grapes. These are the characteristics in general that I think you should be aware of grapes, right? So this should be a no-brainer, but I just want to make sure people are aware of this. They are a vine. And so because they are a vine, they're going to have the vine growth habit, which is a creeping, crawling type habit. They don't have an erect growth habit like a tree or a shrub. So if you want them to get them up off of the ground and quit crawling around, you need to provide them some support. They don't have a backbone, right? And the reason for that is they have a lower lignin content in their wood comparative to trees. And that's why they don't have their own support structure. So they're really good at crawling around and pulling themselves up with their tendrils. So they can grow on things you don't want them to grow on, right? They could pull themselves up. A lot of times we see images of grapes or other types of vines growing on the sides of buildings, especially brick. And that actually can be damaging to the structure itself. But just be aware that they can grow and crawl where you don't want them, as well as where you do. But you need to provide them support.
Because on a brick building or a brick surface, can't the tendrils start to burrow into the mortar and those types of things and just destroy how the brick is put together? Yeah.
Yep. They just deteriorate the brick, from what I understand. And I don't think it's as big of an issue with grapes, but other ones like clematis and those are probably a little more aggressive. Another concept that you need to be aware of is soil drainage. So grapes, what we talk about with them is they don't like wet feet. And what we mean by that is they don't like their roots saturated all the time. They need to have soil moisture, right? But they don't like standing water for long periods of time or that water to be saturated. And what that means is it depletes the roots of oxygen. And so
do they prefer sandy soils?
They do good in all types of soil conditions. Okay. Yeah. And so
just not standing pools of water.
Right. Standing pools of water. And so you need to know your soil condition and manage your irrigation appropriately. So if you're in a clay soil where it doesn't drain as well, your irrigation timing needs to be your irrigation frequency, I should say, needs to be spaced out to allow that soil to drain to a certain potential for them to come back. They're a drought tolerant species. That they naturally are drought tolerant, but they grow in clay, they grow in sand. So I've seen some funky photos from Florida, and there's grape vineyards growing on sandy beaches, right? So they can tolerate that, but they've grown in the heavy clay of Sheridan, Wyoming as well.
So when you say that they don't like it, does that mean that they won't establish or that they'll die or that they'll just be less like vigorous than they would be otherwise?
Right. That's a good question. When I mean they don't like it is you can drown the plant. If you do it enough, frequent enough, you will first inhibit or restrict its growth or its potential of fruit. But if you do it long enough, you will kill the vine. You can drown the vine, basically. So Yeah, and we'll get to soil a little bit, but yeah, they grow in all types of soil, but on the extreme soil conditions, especially if you get into the clays, right? My speculation is they're not going to grow in a bentonite clay.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't drain enough. But if you have a heavy clay content in your soil, it's still going to grow or has the potential of growing. So the other thing usually, and this is specifically for fruit production, we want full sunlight, right? They can grow in partial shade. That's not an issue. And we'll talk about that. A lot of these characteristics and what we're talking about are not hard set fast rules, right? So there's exceptions to everything I'm going to say. And that's what makes it a little challenging.
The answer is it depends.
It depends, right? But that's a benefit for everyone as well, because right. If it depends, there's a chance it'll grow in your situation. You don't have to have the ideal situation, right? Pruning, these tend to need pruned annually. Not always, right? So if you want the covered arbor or the covered building, pruning is probably on a minimum side. But if you're going to go for fruit production and really push for yield and quality of fruit, you need to prune annually. And if we have time, we'll try and get to a little bit of pruning, but that might be a topic we need to cover and handle on in more detail at a different time. So
when you're invited back.
If we'll see how it goes. Yeah. But pruning, so with the pruning of the grapevines, another part of it with grapes, in comparison to trees, let's talk fruit trees real quick. So fruit trees, at least from my basic information on those, when we prune fruit trees, you know, you're looking at maybe 30 to 40% pruning off of that growth matter to push for yield. With grapes, we're looking at 80%, 90%. It's a heavy hedge type pruning. We remove a lot of biomass every year off of these vines.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that. The other thing is, if you're going to go for fruit production, you're not, I'm always going to trip myself up on this, but you should not anticipate fruit until the third or fourth year of that vine's growth.
You shouldn't allow the plant to produce fruit.
Exactly.
Because it probably will, right?
It will. Every year, we don't want it to. Yeah. And so if you do plant grapes, they will produce fruit the first year if you allow them.
So Jeremiah, I think what you're really trying to do by preventing them from fruiting the first couple of years is really establishing a strong root system. And then once you get that established, then anytime after that, fruit production is great.
Right. And on top of it, by delaying fruit production, just like what you're talking about, Jeff, we allow that vine to get established really well and get a robust root system and also a trunk, a very robust trunk for stability. And if you allow that vine to get that characteristic, it will actually increase your fruit production because you delayed the fruiting. The one thing I probably failed to put on this slide, but I really want to mention, if you have commitment issues, maybe grapes are not for you, right? So, and I say that in jokingly, but grapes, they're a perennial plant. There are grapevines over in Europe that are over 100 years old and still producing fruit, right? So these are a long-term commitment. You're waiting 3 or 4 years to get fruit from them. Some of us are not that patient, right? This guy right here, but the commitment to these vines. So you want to make sure to do everything right beforehand, before you get those vines established and planted, if you have that option, because you could have these vines for 20, 30, 40 years or more. We don't know the length of life of vines in Wyoming. It's still new and young, but there are vines in Wyoming that are probably hitting around 10 to 15 years old and are doing really good. So it's a commitment.
Yes, definitely.
Just know that. So what Jeff was talking about, what we are asking and clarified on, is with those roots and that robust trunk system, these are the things we're trying to manage. And we want to get as strong of a vine as fast as possible to help us manage and mitigate Wyoming's harsh conditions. And so the harsh conditions that Wyoming throws at these grapevines is going to be, and we've talked about it a lot on this show with other plants and other, especially vegetables or other production, is short growing season, right? And so that's that frost-free period in the growing season, typically around May to September-ish time period, but it's different based on your location in the state and your elevation. And I believe, Jenny, I think you have that chart that's on the B&B Live. So if people aren't familiar with their area, we can share that.
Yep.
Two big things that tend to whop our grapes pretty good, and a lot of produce or a lot of plant material in Wyoming is a late freeze and an early freeze. And that almost sounds to me always that those are backwards, but it's a late freeze in the spring and an early freeze in the fall. And so a good example is last year in September, I want to say it was September 8th or maybe September 9th, somewhere in there, we had an early freeze, right? The temperatures dropped for 24 hours and froze overnight. We did not get any fruit production out of the vineyard in Sheridan or Powell because of that freeze.
Yep.
We also did not go out and try and protect the fruit, right? We did not try and put blankets over it and that. So you could do some protection efforts on that. But those events, that's when the vine is the most critical, right? In the springtime, it's breaking bud, it's starting to grow. And if it's that new growth is coming out and then we get a freeze a couple weeks later, it can really set the vine back. It may not kill it. It may kill it down to the ground and not kill the roots, but it may set it back. And if it kills it back to the ground, we can retrain, we can regrow from that root system. It's a perennial. So, but it might put us back.
Yeah, you're almost at 0.0, but at least you have a good root system established already.
Right. The other one is just how cold and harsh our winters are. And this is really going to drive more to the sub-zero temperatures that we get. Right. So it's not uncommon in Wyoming that we hit negative temperatures for a set period of time in the winter. Over here in the Bighorn Basin, I've seen it down into negative 35 for a week on end at this point. I know historically there's been other times in Wyoming's history where we've been colder. And so that is really hard and harsh on these vines. And so we got to survive that. Okay. So as you can see, the first four are all climatic things we're trying to manage and mitigate against. And so that's things we can manage and do. And there's certain tips or secrets to overcome some of those, but it's going to be unique to your specific area. And that's why I can't give the, oh, well, you just do this, right? It's very specific. Also, with our vineyards, we can create microclimates within those vineyards that positively benefit the management for these. And then the last one is our wildlife. You grow it and they will come, right? I mean, and that's it for everything, but grapes in particular. So,
is the primary reason deer are an issue is because they're browsing on the vines?
Yeah, yep. So early in the season, and it's all through the growing season when the vines are growing, deer and rabbits, and there's probably others out there, but those are the two I threw on there. They will physically eat the vines. Right, they'll come along. We had a deer over at the Sheridan R&E Center, and it'd come along and nip the tops of the vines off every morning. So that was really helpful to our productive growth.
It was assisting in pruning.
Assisting, poor pruning. Yeah. And so
it was a good pruner, but it was assisting.
Right. But so for the deer and rabbits, those type of animals, a physical barrier is going to be your best management of mitigating that from your vines. So you want a very robust fence, and you're looking at a woven wire fence, typically chain link fence, something like that, that's going to have very small holes to get through and be a physical deterrent to keep them out. Once we start producing fruit, birds are going to be another big issue. And if you don't manage for the birds, you potentially might not get a yield at all. They can take it all if you're not careful. So management of that is going to be netting the vines, also using bird deterrents. So they have some of those balloons that you blow up and have an eye on them, putting an owl statue in the vineyard, maybe a scarecrow kind of thing. But again, a physical barrier is the best management you can do. If you can overlap that with the scare tactics, it really helps. So that's what we're going to manage for. So let's get into talking about grapes. Let's get off the downer side and talk about how we can actually do
Let's be
this.
more positive.
More positive. Let's turn the show around right now. Come on. So at least for me, if you've ever talked to me or worked with me, I really try and go off of people's goals and aspirations, right? I don't believe in a cookie cutter fashion of that. This is the answer. It really depends, as we've already covered. But at least for grapes, there's kind of two methods that people want to see out of their vines. So one is, I want fruit production. I want to manage for fruit production. And then the opposite is aesthetic value. That is the most important to them. And if I get some grapes, so that's great, wonderful. But I really want it for the aesthetic and the beauty, right? So
Jeremiah,
go ahead.
I have a question here for the aesthetic. So I'm thinking about the grapes just in my own yard that I've planted, and they're kind of next to a patio and definitely an aesthetic view. But as you're going through some of these lists of traits that, you know, the grapes like or prefer, they don't necessarily check all those boxes. So I'm assuming that there's some more flexibility with maybe the aesthetic value versus your fruit production, and what can maybe work or be successful.
Right. Yep. And that's probably one of the positives to a grapevine, right? They are very versatile and they have a lot of give and take to them. They tolerate a lot of abuse, so to speak. So if you don't prune them just right, or if they're not planted in the right place, it doesn't mean they won't grow, right? But if, in example, so I told you that we want to plant them and have them in full sunlight. However, there are exceptions to that rule. They will grow in shade. However, they just might not be the most fruitful, right? Or a partial shade. Here in Wyoming, we get very intense solar radiation from our sunshines. We have so much sun, we're high elevation, so we got a lot of UV rays. And so it doesn't hurt if that vine sees a little partial shading at some point, especially in the afternoon, in the heat of the day. A little bit of shading, and we have seen sun scalding, or it's a sunburn on the berries of our grapes. And so they do need a little bit of shading, or shading can be a positive, but they do need some sunlight. And that's where probably one of the major differences are for fruit production versus aesthetic value. So in aesthetic value, you can see with this arbor here that they have over their gazebo. When the grape, if it produces fruit, those grapes are going to hang down into that gazebo, and all that foliage around it is going to shade those berries from the sunlight. And the berries actually need full exposure to the sunlight to help them in their berry maturation and help those berries develop. Does it mean you won't get fruitful fruit, right? You won't get a productive vine and no, you will get fruit in there, but your berry quality is going to suffer because of it, right? The clusters might not go through veraison or the changing of color uniformly, right? One of the bigger things you're going to see is in a fruit production system, we want those berries in full sunlight. We want the vines in full sunlight. We see a higher sugar content in fruit production versus aesthetic values where they're shaded.
Sure.
So
those grapes
variable.
that you get from the grocery store that are a little bit sour, they weren't in full sunlight.
That is possible, but most likely that's a variety.
Sure.
So the green grapes I think you're thinking of.
Well, you know, every once in a while you'll come across a cluster that you buy that it's
a little bitter.
Yeah.
Or they were harvested early, right?
Sure.
They weren't allowed to develop. So yeah, it could be a shading effect, but there's other contributors to that. So before we go further, before people want to plant their vines, make sure you pick what is most important to you, right? We can have a blend of these two. You can have the aesthetic value and have some fruit production. However, you're sacrificing, is all I want you to be aware of as you move forward. All right. So the number one, again, I told you this is a commitment here. And so since we're going into a commitment, when you're committing to these vines, you can do some things wrong in the beginning that will impact those vines for the rest of their life. Or you can set them up in a situation that benefits them for the rest of their life. And you're never going to find the ideal location because there's conflicting things on everything. And it's area specific, it's site specific for these vines. And that's a benefit for you because you can work on your property and figure out what's best on your property and just manage for that. But looking at a site, what do we want to look for? Soil. That's usually a positive. We don't plant them in the air, but for the soil, as I mentioned before, they are planted in a wide array of soil types and textures. They do well in those. You want to stay away from high saline soils, and you want to stay away from heavy clay soils like bentonites, right? That won't drain. We already talked about that.
Hey, Jeremiah, if
Yeah.
you were going to do some soil amendments, because you know that like I'm thinking about the high clay soil and it might be a little bit on that bentonite side, doing some soil amendments, or how far, like deep down in the soil, do I need to change things up or, mix in some soil amendments? How far are those roots going to go?
Or how bad does it have to be before you decide that, no, I'm not going to grow grapes here?
Right.
Right. That's a great question. And I'll try and answer it the best I can. So your soil quality is going to dictate that. So you get into the higher saline, that's what's going to restrict you in terms of vine growth. And I can't tell you, there are some vines that tolerate salt a little bit better, but I can't tell you the actual number of salt that you need to be looking for. But
Sure.
just the higher on that scale, the least likely you're going to have, or those vines are going to struggle. pH, I don't think there's a restriction on pH yet. We have some vines growing in a pH of 8.3, 8.5. So if you got to an 8.10, maybe I'd start questioning it, or a 9.5 or higher kind of thing, that you might have problems. A fun fact on soils, grapes historically were put in the non-productive soil conditions. The non-fertile soils is where grapes have historically been grown. That's a positive for Wyoming. That describes every soil type we have, right? And so you don't have to have the most luscious, most fertile soil conditions to grow grapes. They were considered to be thrown into those non-productive, poor soil conditions, right? So in terms of amending that soil, if you're going to amend the soil, you want to do that prior to planting. You want to, and I hear two different theories on it. One theory is I need to amend that soil and try and adjust it to get that plant established. So you're going to want to put it around the root that you plant in. And we'll talk about planting in here in a bit, but you're going to want to go, 2 widths wider than the roots for your hole and the depth of your roots. You want to amend that space. But these roots, they're drought tolerant. So these roots are going to go really deep in the soil. You cannot amend all of that soil. It's not feasible. It's not economical. And I think your back would hurt by the end of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you are going to amend, that's when you want to do it. If you're going to amend those soils, the rule of thumb I've heard is you don't want to amend more than 1/3 of the natural soil in terms of volume. So you want 2/3 natural soil, 1/3 in a volume standpoint of your amendment.
Okay.
The other theory I've heard is, gosh darn it, if you're going to be hardy and grow in Wyoming, you're just going to have to be tough and suck it up and grow in the natural soil, and I'm not amending you. So I think it's on the personal perspective of the individual that's going at it. Amendments will help. The negative that I've heard of amending the soil is then once the roots start growing out in the native soil, they've been kind of pampered and spoiled and are not hardened to those soil conditions. And I think you can argue that either way. I don't know what's best. So I think that's a positive for us. We have soil and it's poor soils, and grapes do fairly well in poor soils. Climatic, we talked about those. that's dealing with microclimates. I don't have much time to get through all of this, so we'll just hit the highlights. Topography, elevation, location, that helps manage those climatic factors. So planting vines on a south or southeast orientation of a structure or a windbreak is going to buffer some of the colder temperatures in the winter, buffer some of those winds, right? However, we don't want to completely stop the wind flow in our vineyard. We want air currents through our vineyard to keep it dried out, because if we shut off the wind, we can easily create a humidity problem and cause more disease.
Yep.
So the aspect of where you plant those, right? We don't want to necessarily, traditionally, if we're going for fruit production, we don't want to plant those vines on the north side of our house where they're going to be in a lot of shade. We want in full exposure, but we can benefit from some of those plantings of orientation. If you have the option, we don't all have that option, but if you do, topography, vineyards, if you look at vineyards over in Germany and Italy, they are planted on slopes. There's a lot of them planted on slopes, and that's to get the air currents and masses. So if you can plant your vineyard on a slope, you're going to benefit from that. And the reason for that is cold air sinks to the bottom of the valley, right? The coldest air is going to be on the river bottoms, on the flats, right? So if you plant your vineyard on the slope, you're going to have warmer air there. Okay. Mm-hmm. So other crops, you can read that, but that you want to spend a lot of time in picking the best location you possibly can on your property before taking the dive and being committed to vines. Are we good?
Yeah, we have one comment from Annie. She says that we dug trenches with a backhoe, scooped up the soil, and then put it back so as to reduce or break up different horizons in the soil that might limit or block the roots from growing.
Perfect.
If you have access to a backhoe.
Yeah, I want an access to a backhoe. That sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. That and definitely that would definitely work out really good. And you're going to loosen up that soil profile and make it easy on you for planting. Excellent. And then that's probably also easy in terms of shifting those vines in terms of spacing from one vine to a next. So excellent.
And that's one of the things I wanted to comment on one of your previous pictures, Jeremiah. That setup where you show the fruit production versus aesthetics. In that fruit production area, you have wall-to-wall weed barrier down just to help assist and suppress the weeds from coming through, which can be a significant problem in vineyards.
Yeah. Oh, yes, a good comment. Weed control in vineyards is horrendous. And there's no great answer for it. There's different methods to go about it. So the vineyard, that vineyard picture that I showed is the one here in Powell. It is bare soil. So it was bare soil between the vines. We were constantly having to manually pull weeds, and it was overrun with weeds. So we laid down the landscaping fabric to help us manage that and make it easier. We still have to pull weeds where the plants are, but not between rows. Over in Sheridan, they have turf. So it's an old hay field. So there's alfalfa and grass between the rows. And so we utilize and mow that. The other issue is grapes are very sensitive to herbicides, especially for broadleaf weeds. They're kind of like tomatoes. If they get a whiff of it on the wind, they'll crinkle up and roll up. So,
and they let you know they don't feel good.
Right, they definitely do. And so pesticides are really not a good option for weed control in our vineyards. This picture, once you've determined a site, pick out how you want your layout for your vineyard. But the biggest thing to point out in this is install everything you're going to have for that vineyard before you plant. You want to put your fencing in. You want to put in your trellising or your support structures. You want to dig and trench in the laterals or water lines or whatever you have going on to irrigate. You want all that done before you plant your vineyard, because you don't want to plant those vines and then have to try and work around it, especially if you're using a backhoe or equipment in any fashion.
Well, and your spacing between the rows, not between your posts, is really dependent upon the type of equipment that you have or expect that you'll be driving down that space. So
exactly.
That could probably be adjusted.
Yeah, this is all adjustable. right? And so this is kind of a rule of thumb just to get people started. So distance between rows is 10 feet, right? If you're going to be driving equipment down that, like a certain type of mower on a tractor or something like that, make sure it's spaced appropriately so you can fit that equipment down the row, or a pickup, or whatever you're wanting to do. Spacing between vines, this is going to be a rule of thumb. So it depends on variety. 6 feet between varieties, you can go up to 10 feet. So if they're a very aggressive, prolific vine, go wider apart, farther apart. If they're not as prolific of a vine, don't grow as quickly, you can go a 5-6 foot spacing. And that will, and what we're trying to accomplish in a fruit production system, and usually in an aesthetic value, we want a complete canopy closure and a curtain of vegetation, right? And so if they're spaced too close together and they're prolific vines, they're going to be growing together. So, and then space your posts out so they don't fall in a spot where your vines are, basically.
Mm-hmm.
This one, structure. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on structure. We can argue and debate this all day long. The two trellis systems that are at the Powell Vineyard and the Sheridan Vineyard is the high wire cordon trellis system. But the big thing you want to know is the varieties that do well here, you want to get the vines 5 to 6 feet off the ground.
Wow.
Period.
Why,
that's where our
why is that? Why is that?
So that's where our fruit production is.
Okay.
So our and we'll get to it here in a bit, but our varieties have a drooping habit, right? We need to get them up high and then they droop down, and that those varieties produce fruit at the top of the vine. That
so
gives them.
So you don't have to bend over to harvest them.
Well, not as much. It's not that reason though, Jeff. I mean, that's a good side effect, right?
It is a consideration.
A good consideration, but one of the main reasons is to get the growth points of those vines up out of the cold ground, right?
Sure.
European bunch grapes, which we cannot grow here, which are mainly grown in California, grow up to the first wire and then grow vertically. And all their fruit is on that bottom wire. If we went with that trellising system, we'd lose our vines and our fruit, because it's the growth point of those vines is too close to the ground, and it's going to be right next to that cold layer of air during our winter time. So this is the same thing for aesthetic value. If you want to have an arbor or that vine growing on something, it needs to be a minimum of 5 feet off of the ground to try and give them a chance. Okay. So this is what everybody probably really came for. They want to know grape varieties. What should I grow, right? So European bunch grapes, those are the ones that when people talk about grapes, these are the ones you see in the store, the table grapes, the big berries. You see the pictures from California. That's what we're talking about there. Muscadine grapes is another variety of grapes, mostly out of the east part of North America here. We don't want those either. These are three that we don't want. They don't do well here. They don't tolerate the cold. Their growth habits are all wrong for us. Then you'll get into grafted varieties. So they'll take a natural root system, so a native grape root system, and then graft on a European bunch grape, Muscadine grapes, very much like we do in fruit trees. However, in vines, and I don't know why it's different, but in those vines, those grafted unions will freeze and die. And thus you're left with the native rootstock, which is great for disease tolerant, drought tolerant, all that, but they produce really tiny berries and they're not very fruitful and not very productive. So what we're going to look for is hybrids. These are hybrid stock that are bred specifically for cold hardy zones. So a lot of these are coming out of New York, Minnesota. They're everywhere. There's a lot of them. You're going to want to select those off of what you want to grow for wine, for table grapes. We want an early season variety. We want a short growing season. Those will have the potential of making the best for us. If you get into mid-season or late maturing varieties, they're not going to grow. Also, we want to pick on our color of our berries, and we can even get into cluster arrangement, but we'll we'll save that for another day. So with grapes, it's kind of crazy. If you're a livestock person, you might have heard this before, but a lot of people talk about lineages, right? Of breeding of that stock, especially in horses, but especially in cattle and sheep, it's there too, it's prevalent. In our plants, we have certain plants that have that type as well, if you get into it. Grapes are one of those. They tell you the lineage and parentage of those vines. And so this is Frontenac. It's a red berry. It's a wine grape. And so you want to look for this in the parentage. This V. riparia, that stands for Vitis riparia, and that's the genus and species name for native grapes. And so that native grape has been bred into this cultivar or this variety to make it cold hardy. And thus it's a little bit disease tolerant. It adds some benefit. So that's one indicator that, hey, that has a potential of growing really well here in Wyoming. The number afterwards, 89, that doesn't matter specifically, just the V. riparia. And then this negative 33 degrees Fahrenheit, that's another good indicator. So a lot of times in our produce and our grapes and all of our production for vegetables and fruits, they go off of cold hardy zones. And those are good indicators. But for Wyoming, I think this number is better than those cold hardy zones. So if you go to a big box store and look at grapes, they will tell you cold hardy zone, but you might want to look for, if you can get to this number, this tells you it'll live down to this temperature, negative 33. And that's a wintertime low type temperature, right?
It's also good to see that variety is basically immune to downy mildew.
Yeah, that helps too, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of characteristics you can choose off of those, and there's a plethora of varieties to select. So these are some of the varieties that have been very successful in the two vineyards here in Powell and at Sheridan. So Frontenac Gris, Markel Foch, Marquette, Osceola Muscat, La Crescent, and Brianna. So you can see they're red. You can look those up. But that's what we have in our vineyard. Does that mean that that's all that's going to grow here? No. There's also the situation where we've tried growing a variety known as King of the North, and it did not do well in our location. However, I've talked to a producer in Wyoming, actually out of Worland, who loves King of the North, and it grows very well at their site. So it's going to be site specific. But these are the characteristics that we talked about before you want to look for to see how successful it could be. In that grape guide that we mentioned earlier at the beginning, this is the list of varieties in there. So there's a little bit more there for you. Also, I've provided Jenny with a document that I pulled off of the Minnesota Grape Growers Association, and they have a list of varieties. I don't know how many is on there, maybe 50 or 100 varieties. And so that's, I'll have Jenny share that with the recording and up on the B&B website, and that'll be available for everyone. And so look at that. And not all of those are going to work here, but you can look at those characteristics and select ones that have a good potential. Questions on varieties? I kind of went through those quickly.
I'm not seeing any questions. I don't know if Jenny has anything coming through on Facebook or not, but if we do, we'll push them at you. So
sounds good.
So it looks like your chart lists the uses. So if people have a particular interest in making wine and just using it for jelly, which is what I often do around here, they can look at that and kind of get an idea of what the variety would be best used for. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, that's correct. And I would just buffer that a little bit. That is 100% correct. And when you select some, they're going to have that use. But grapes are a mixed use. They truly are. So a lot of times, the wine is going to be the most driving factor, right? So the variety and even the soil condition that variety is grown in is going to give that wine a certain type of aroma, flavor, right? Bodiness or deepness to that. And so if you're going to go for wine, you really need to pay attention to that and get a wine grape. However, we have taken the grapes that we have grown, which are mostly wine grapes, and made jellies and jams out of them. You can juice them. So Concord, a lot of people know of Concord grapes. Concords grow here. They're a multi-purpose grape. They can do a wine, but they're also a really, really good juice grape. The difference is, so if it's a table grape or a wine grape, it can be a juice or jelly grape. And the reason I say that is because it depends on your recipe. So if you do juice or jelly, we can add sugar to that to sweeten it. So if it's a wine grape and it's a little bit on the bitter side, we can add some sugar and sweeten it up and it be a good juice grape, right? So they're kind of multi-purpose. The biggest differences is wine versus table grapes.
So I think the word you might have been looking for was astringent instead of bitter.
Okay. We'll go with astringent.
So we do have a question for you, Jeremiah.
Yeah.
From Gwen, are seedless varieties less cold hardy in general?
Oh, I should have mentioned that. Good question, Gwen, and I appreciate it. Keep me on my toes, keep me honest. So seedless. So what we have found at the Sheridan R&E Center and the Powell R&E Center is table grapes tend to be less cold hardy than wine grapes. And I don't think it has to do with it necessarily being seedless, right? We screened some table grape varieties that were seeded, but they do tend to be a little less cold hardy. And so with the seedless, you'll see that. However, on this chart, you can see that there are some seedless recommended for a zone 4. So Jeff, you guys are in a zone 4, is that right?
We're pushing 5.
You're pushing 5. So, I mean, it might work down there. It's just so unique.
So Jeremiah, I don't know how much you really want to get into this, but so I have the Somerset grapes at my house. I've only had them for a season, so I don't have a lot to add there. But my grandpa and Cody has had grapes, I'd say like as long as I've been alive, 35 years, 40, 50 years, I'm not sure. Are there some things to consider, challenges, potential problems as far as tracking down someone that has grapes and trying to, I don't know, transplant or take a cutting of those sorts of grapes?
A great question. Yes. So a lot of times we sit there and look at it and say, if my neighbor can grow it and I can get cuttings off of that, most likely I can grow it, right? So if it's already growing in the area, that's a good indicator. And you can do that. You could take cuttings from somebody else, propagate that and grow it on your place. I do caution on that a lot of times for doing that, and for a couple reasons. The first one is, if you are specific on a certain type of variety, or you're trying to go for something specifically for wine, getting a cutting off of that, a lot of times we don't know what that vine is unless that person planted it themselves and have kept good records. But a lot of times we have these places where it has a vine on the place that was planted, 2 or 3 homeowners ago, and we don't know what it is. So that's one. You don't know the variety if you're going for something specific. But the bigger issue I would have is there are diseases that are within the vine. And if you propagate off of that vine and it has galls, crown gall, or any of those other diseases that are internal, right? You are just transferring that disease with you. You're just taking it with you. And again, we talked about commitment, and that could be a deal breaker for you being productive. And so you could propagate and grow that. And in 3 to 5 years, when you're trying to grow grapes and you're struggling and the vine's not doing well, and then you find out, oh, it had a disease, you just now wasted all your efforts and time for 5 years. So starting with good stock is a must with these, especially if they can go 100 years. So I really encourage people to go to a licensed nursery. And the reason for that is they are screening their varieties for diseases. So you're getting as clean of a stock as you possibly can, disease-free. Our local nurseries, they can do a pretty good job at getting us clean stock too. So you just got to have that conversation with them. If you buy them at the big box stores, hardware stores, Walmart, Kmart, Home Depot, those kind of things, you get what you get, right? They might be screened, they might not be screened, and you don't know. And it's hard to find out if they are. Sometimes they also bring in stock that just is not suited for the area and doesn't do as well. Getting to your point of, so sometimes we can buffer these varieties as well. So it might be a zone 4, right? And we can grow it because we provide some microclimate ability, right? We provided some protection and sheltering that might make that vine grow a little more vigorous than if I live out of town and have no protection to the vines kind of concept.
Sure.
So, yep. Did we answer that question?
Yeah, I think so.
I believe so.
Okay. Planting. This is planting like any perennial plant, tree, shrub, any perennial plant that you're going to plant. I have these. These are NRCS fact sheets guides on how to plant for bare root trees and shrubs or bald and burlap stock. And so a lot of times, if you order from a nursery in particular, you'll get bare root stock a lot of the time. If you propagate your own, or if you buy it at a big box store or a local nursery, they will come in a container. And so the general rule of thumb is you want to go twice as wide as the diameter of the container, or twice as wide as the roots, and then as deep as the roots.
Unless you have access to a backhoe.
Unless you have access to a backhoe and then have fun, right? But you want to plant them, you don't want to plant them too deep. The flare of the roots is where you want that. So that's the crown of the plant. It's the union between the trunk and the roots. That needs to be at soil level, soil surface. So just don't plant them too deep if you're going with the backhoe method.
Yes.
Other thoughts on planting? Plant them and then water them. Get that soil hydrated. Okay, how are we doing on time, guys?
You have about 8 minutes, or well,
okay.
you have less. You have. Let's put it this way: you have less than 8 minutes. Because
hey, try and get through this. I think I only got a couple more slides left. So, what we want to accomplish, right? So we plant our vine, and what we want to do is start training that vine. And so you can see in the picture on the right, there's a green stake. It's kind of hard to see. It's actually a fiberglass training stake. You can buy them. Usually you have to order those in. Now and then I see them in big box stores. For the first year or two, you can go with the little bamboo stakes. They do pretty good. But once that vine gets a little robust and heavy, they just snap those bamboo stakes. So if you go with the fiberglass rods, they hold up really, really well. But you want to get that vine to grow to the top of your structure, your training system, right? So in a fruit production, it's usually a trellis. If you're in an aesthetic value, you want to get it trained up on your structure up to that 5, 6 or higher feet, right? We're not going to prune that grapevine. We want all the biomass we can get, especially leaf matter, because the more leaves we have on that vine means more food and sugar and nutrients for that vine to grow, and they're going to grow faster and more vigorously. So what you do is you just loosely grab all those vines. It's not going to be just one. Usually it's multiple vines, and you grab those up and just loosely tie them to your training stake, and go out another week later and it'll grow, and pull that up. And you just want it to encourage it to grow vertically to the top of the line.
so you're not pruning it down to one main leader. You're just letting whatever grows grow and clumping that up on the training stake. Nice.
Yep. That's the first year, right? And what we're trying to do is we want as much growth as fast as possible. And so we don't, if we start pulling leaves off or vines off at this point, we're going to start restricting nutrients and growth of the vine, right? So the second year, so hopefully our goal is hopefully we can get the vine to the top growth of our structure, right? Hopefully 5 feet at a minimum. And here's an example. There was a grower that contacted us and was like, I have all these varieties, and this one variety in particular just will not produce fruit. And we were talking to him, and his training system, his trellis was up to 4 feet high. And we said, move it to 5 feet. He moved it the next year 1 foot higher, which is not easy on the vine. You're better to train to the height you need right off the start. But he trained to 5 feet the next year, and he had fruit. It can be that sensitive in areas. So get to 5 feet. So that's what we're trying to accomplish the first year, is get that vine up to 1 year's growth. Don't prune it at all. Water it heavily before the ground freezes. Soak that, saturate that soil. Okay, second year, go out and assess the vine. Don't go prune it. Give it some time. Let it wake up, let it break bud, and figure out where it has growth, where it's still alive at. There is going to be winter desiccation and death, especially in the smaller twigs and the ends of the vines. But if you have growth at the top of the vine, then we can start training down the trellis and start training our arms and start looking for fruit production type structure. If it dies back to the ground, don't be discouraged. Prune off all the dead stuff. And we're talking like the end of May, beginning of June, assessing this. Give it plenty of time to wake up and grow, right? Okay. If it's not growing and it's dead, trim it to the ground. New shoots and suckers will come from the ground, from the crown, as long as the roots aren't dead. And then do again like we did the first year. And sometimes it takes a year or two to get it up to the top wire and maintain growth above ground at that top wire. That's what you're trying to do for the first 3 years.
Okay.
Then the other thing is, we talked about this, they will produce fruit. Believe it or not, no matter what animal you talk about, flowering and fruiting is sexual reproduction in plants. And reproduction is an energy hog. It expends a lot of nutrients and resources. So don't let it fruit and flower those first 2-3 years. Let it put all that energy and nutrients into the trunk and the roots. That's what we want. We want above ground growth. So these are what flowers look like. And so as they start breaking out, and you can, when they're this little, you can just take your finger or thumb and just rub them off, and they'll just break right off easily. If you let them go further and are a little more mature, they're a little more robust. They hold on a little more. You might want to take some pruners, some little hand pruners, and just nip them off. You don't want any flowers. Don't let it get to fruit.
Don't wait that long.
Don't wait that long. Rub them off when you see them. Take them off. Because as they develop, they're expending energy. So the sooner you can rub them off, the better. So you want to maintain that. Once we get that, so this is what 3rd and 4th year, we're wanting to go to grapes. Right? On our 3rd, 4th year, if you have good growth on the trellis by year 3 or year 4, it might take you 5, right? You might die to the ground a couple times, might need to get trained up. That's when we can start going for fruit growth. If it keeps dying back to the ground for 3 or 4 years in a row, you probably don't have a variety that's well suited for your site. Got to start over. Okay. So this is what we're looking at for fruit production. We're really trying to look for the trunk and trying to develop what they call the cordons or the arms. Okay. The trunk gets robust and it holds the vine up. In year 2, we can start narrowing that down to a single leader or 2, right? So we can have 1 or 2 trunks. In cold regions, they recommend 2 or 3 trunks, because if you lose an entire trunk, then you don't lose the entire vine. There might be 1 trunk that still survives. So I would recommend 1 or 2 trunks, your decision. In year 2, that's when we prune to 1 or 2 vines, right? If we get to the top wire and we start growing our cordons down the wires, we want to prune off all leaf and foliage that's growing on the trunk. We want no new vines coming off of the trunk. We want to keep them a solid single trunk. And we get our cordons established. Then from our cordons, you can see the green foliage coming off the cordon. Those are considered canes, also called shoots, but they're the new year's growth. Grapes only flower on the first year wood. They do not flower off of the second year wood. So that's really important. So our fruit production is going to come off of the canes, and we want those canes to hang down to the ground. And they're going to be, and we just want to make a wall of vegetation there, right? So that's what we're trying to accomplish in a general rule of thumb and practice. In terms of the cordon, that second or third year, when you're training that cordon down the wire, you want to let it grow as far as it will. If you get that established the third year, you want to go in there and count the number of nodes, or where the little buds are, the growth patterns on the cordons. Count those, count around 12 to 20, depends on the variety, and terminate the cordon at that point. Okay. So pruning and that management manages how many buds are available on a vine, which correlates to how much yield and growth it has and how much fruit you'll bear. If you do not prune or manage how much growth it has, I want to say a mature vine can produce upwards of 400 plus buds a year, and each bud would create a cluster or two of grapes. Basically what you're going to get is a lot of berries, but they're all going to be itty bitty tiny. And so you need to thin the herd a little bit so we get some nice fat juicy berries out there. How's that? Is that pretty clear? Any thoughts or questions on that?
Yes, we have some things filtering through. If you would like to take a whack at them.
We'll take a whack.
Jody is asking if you could use a cattle panel for an arch for a trellis.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have seen where somebody took a cattle panel and bent it over the corner of their yard. They had a chain link fence and they arched that cattle panel over that corner of that fence and then trained the vine up that. And it was really cool because the berries and the clusters hung down in that panel and the dogs laid under it for shade. It made it really easy to harvest the fruit, the clusters. However, if you did it in that type of fashion, those berries are not going to get shade, and thus you would have a decreased berry size and quality, so to speak. The one thing I would not do not weave the vines through the cattle panel. So you wouldn't go on one side of a square through the other side, and you don't want to weave them through there. Because as that trunk grows and those canes grow, it's going to start girdling at those pinch points where it goes around that vine, and you're going to kill that vine over time. So you can use it as a support structure, but you want to loosely tie those to that support structure. If you do a Google search for vineyard supplies, there's some, I don't know what it's called, but it's a tubing. It's a plastic rubberized tubing that you can purchase at orchards and nurseries and that, and it's just training ties, and you just tie them up and it'll expand and stretch. You want to go in and cut those ties every so often and loosen them. Also, people use bed sheets. They'll make strips out of their bed sheets and use those to tie them up. So you want it to be fairly loose. Don't use it to wind it or support it, right? You just want the structure there to tie to.
No restriction points, basically.
Right, because as they grow and grow rapidly over 5 years, and you can start seeing restriction points even on the wires. So if you do a trellis, you don't want that the arm or the shoots to hang on the trellis, because that trellis over time, especially with the weight of the berries and the vegetation, if it gets wet in a rainstorm, it'll start cutting through that and sever the arm.
Okay. Jenny is asking, transplanted after a year would, this is from Facebook, and I think they have moved their plants after a year, and it says transplanted after a year would slow the production, and that's a question.
Yeah. So a lot of times people ask me, well, if I don't like where my vine is, or I moved here and I don't want it there, right? I inherited this vine. Can I relocate it? Can I transplant it? The answer is yes. You would transplant it very much like any other perennial plant. You want to get as much of the root mass as you can to transplant that. So transplanting would be better on a younger vine than an older vine because they have smaller root mass, and it would be easier. You can relocate it, but I would imagine you're going to sever quite a bit of the roots, and thus you're going to cut back some of its capabilities and nutrient storage. And thus you'll stunt the growth for the next year or two until it gets reestablished. And so you want to refocus on that establishment. You can relocate them. It's not that you can't. It's not ideal. If you're going to go for fruit production, that's why you want to spend all that time up front. It's a commitment, right? And ideally, we would like that vine to be in its forever home for 100 years or 120 years. But that doesn't mean you can't be successful in relocating them.
Yeah. Okay. Also, Annie is asking, is Mother's Day still the rule of thumb to start pruning in Sheridan or anywhere in the state?
So yeah, good question. I don't know of a rule of thumb that way in terms of this is kind of the day to do it. So in terms of pruning, if you want to look at commercial vineyards, when do they prune? You want to prune after the coldest part of winter and before bud break. So that varies in Wyoming. It's not set every year. And so what that means is if we have gone through a bout of -degree temperatures and we hit March, and it's most likely we're not going to get into those -degree temperatures again, that's the time period you could start pruning. So March, April window is ideal for pruning. Myself and others in Wyoming, we are not as confident in grape production, right? We don't have the experience in that. And so when you go out and cut 80-90% of these vines off every year, it's kind of a heart stopper. I'm just killing the dang thing.
It's a
right?
little dramatic.
It's very traumatic, and I haven't got over it yet. And so there are people that will wait until after bud break. So they go in and they will prune and know what they'll prune all the dead out, right? And they will make sure when they're cutting, they're keeping so many live buds per cane alive. We did that in the vineyard. We kind of were forced to have to do that because the research, we were assessing viability of the vines. And so we couldn't prune in the dormant season for fear of if we pruned incorrectly, we could be impacting the survivability of the vine. And what we really wanted to know is the vine living here? So we waited until after bud break. You can do it then. It's not ideal because the longer you go past bud break, that plant is expending energies to put on new growth, and you go hack off that new growth, you are just robbing it of those nutrients. So the ideal window, if you can build up your skill and confidence, is going to be in that kind of March, April window. Good question.
Perfect. We're a little bit over time. What else you got left?
Pruning. We might need to save that for another conversation because it's big and elaborate.
Okay.
We had a question come in on Concord Grapes. I wasn't sure quite what they meant by it, but maybe you can talk about them in general. They just said, what about Concord Grapes? So are they suited for Wyoming, for growing in Wyoming?
Yeah. So Concord Grapes. Concord Grapes are a really good variety. I do know of Concord Grapes growing well here in Wyoming. They are kind of a multi-purpose grape. They're more of a juice, jelly, and possibly a table grape. They could be used for wine. I don't think they're used there as much. That, of my knowledge, they're not used there as much. They're more characterized as a juice and jelly grape, and that's why they're a Welch's juice, right? Those kind of jellies and juices commercially, they really play up the Concord. But yes, Concord do really well here. They're a good grape. So that is a variety to possibly look for. Yep.
I'm not seeing any other questions, Jeremiah.
Okay. The last thing I wanted to share, I don't think I threw it in there when we talked varieties. If you get into our mountains here in Wyoming, the Bighorn Mountains, the Absorcas. I'm not sure exactly all where they're at, but there are wild grapes growing in Wyoming, in our mountains. You're going to find them down in the riparian areas, down in the drainages by the creeks and the rivers. So I'm aware of them up in the Bighorn Mountains is where I have seen them. So I don't know about the other mountain ranges, but they naturally are native here, right? There are native grapes here. Those are, you do not want to go get those ones though. You don't want to relocate them. That's illegal off of public ground anyway, but you don't want to relocate them because again, they're not very fruitful. They're going to give you really, really tiny berries and not many of them. But just be aware that we have native grapes here in the area, so you can find them in nature.
All right.
So sounds good. Abby, do you want to take us out for the day?
Yeah, so thank you, Jeremiah, for coming on and talking about grapes. I know that I'm excited. I'm excited for the commitment, I guess, and seeing what the next few years hold for me and grapes. And thank you. Earlier in Jeremiah's presentation, he mentioned the Wyoming grape growing guide. And so if you are somebody who wants that guide, you can stop into your county offices, and a lot of those offices have those guides available to you. I know that here in Carbon County, we have them. Also, what Jenny's pulled up here is our Barnyards and Backyards website. So, oh, and here's the grape growing guide. So on this website, you can find recordings from today if you had to pop off early, or if you want to go back and check out other shows, those recordings are there. Our upcoming recordings for future shows or topics are also available. And then there's just a plethora of information here on the Barnyards and Backyards website with magazine articles and, like I said, previous shows. And then lastly, I think Jenny is going to put up in the chat box for on Facebook and on Zoom, there's an evaluation link. So if you can fill that out, that's greatly appreciated. These shows are for you guys out in the state watching. And so if you can give us feedback of what you like or what you want to see in the future, that really helps us kind of tailor the shows. And here's the county offices if you wanted to go in and get that guide.
Is that it?
Is that it? I think so. I think I covered all the stuff.
Okay, well, for all of us from Barnyards and Backyards Live, thanks for joining us this week, and we'll be back again next week. And I have forgotten what our program will be, but we're looking forward to you all being there.
Wildfire, protecting your
wildfire.
property from wildfire. We have a gentleman coming from Wyoming State Forestry to talk to us all about it. So thank you.
Thanks, Jenny, for keeping us on task.
You bet.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
See
you.
ya.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Have a good weekend, all.